Welcome to Nuclear Nightmares. In this episode we step back to the 60s. Vest-drenching terror is assured in Sidney Lumet's Fail-Safe. Our movie begins with a man suffering from a recurring nightmare. Periodically he dreams of watching a bullfight, and always seems to wake up before the identity of the matador is revealed. The man in question, General Black, is a nuclear strategist for the US Air Force. He explains to his wife his belief that the dream is linked to his increasingly frustrating job, and intimates his desire to resign. His wife feels that that is a bit extreme, and maybe he should not go into work today. Sadly, a group of dignitaries including the Secretary of Defense will be there, so no dice. Meanwhile, at a cocktail party which has gone on for way too long, political scientist, government advisor and all-round asshat Professor Groshaw is holding court. He is not known for his pacifist tendencies and belittles one of the other guests for suggesting that reducing the expected US dead in a nuclear war from 100 million to 60 million is still shit, and that zero would be a better number. Groshaw pours scorn on his less than realistic worldview. On his way out to the party, the professor is accosted by a floozy with a death fixation. He soon identifies her fascination with snuffing out the whole world in a nuclear fireball, and quickly dismisses her as a ghoulish old bag. At the Air Force Command Center in Nebraska, Colonel Castillo is having a crappy start to a day which, let's face it, is not going to improve. He receives a call from home telling him that his father is back on the piss and that he is needed to intervene. His superior officer, General Bogan, needs the colonel back at the base and stages an intervention of his own. The colonel is highly embarrassed by his parents' state. The general does not mention it during the car ride back to the base, and Castillo tries to hide his emotions. At a U.S. bomber base in Anchorage, Alaska, Colonel Grady and his co-pilot reminisce about flying the B-17 and lament how impersonal Bomber Command has become. They don't have long to chat, however, as they are placed on patrol soon afterwards. Meanwhile, back at the base in Nebraska, General Bogan and Colonel Castillo are playing nursemaid to a couple of civilian visitors, a U.S. congressman and the man whose company supplies all the electronics for the military. They are both impressed with the demonstration of the computer's ability to monitor air traffic and alert American personnel accordingly. During their visit, the radar picks up an unidentified aircraft near U.S. airspace and scrambles the fighters. The civilian visitors look on with mounting tension as the computer orders the bombers to their fail-safe positions. The plan being that if the apparent enemy aircraft turns out to be an airliner, there will be enough time to stand the bombers down, and if it is the enemy, there will be enough time to order them to attack. In another room in the same complex, the Secretary of Defense, some of the Joint Chiefs and General Black from earlier are listening to a lecture from Professor Groshaw. The professor expounds his theory of limited exchange, whereby both sides exchange a small amount of nuclear weapons and agree a ceasefire soon afterwards. General Black is unconvinced and does not mind saying so. Back in the war room, it becomes clear that the unidentified aircraft was a commercial airliner after all, and the alert forces are ordered to stand down. Sadly, the computer decides to suffer a malfunction. Not to worry though, the faulty component is replaced and everything is just peachy until the computer unexpectedly orders Colonel Grady's squadron into Soviet territory with the intent of blowing Moscow to tiny little pieces. Shut up. Sadly, it is not simply a question of radioing through the stand-down order. Once the bombers pass their fail-safe positions, they will not accept radio communication until they reach their targets. The President has been informed of the situation, and deep in his bunker beneath the White House, he and his interpreter mull over the options. Firstly, since they cannot order the bombers to return home and no one feels like being vaporized at the moment. The best and only option to save the world is to order the bomber group's fighter escort to turn around, catch up with the bombers and blow them out of the sky. The president knows what he has to do, but asks the Joint Chiefs for their advice. Professor Groschall advocates doing nothing. His suspicion is that the Soviets, as soon as they see the approaching bombers, will realize they cannot survive and surrender immediately. He does explain his logic, but his theory seems to rest on the Soviets reacting in the least likely way. Having concluded that the professor is a gaping asshole, the Joint Chiefs tell the president to give the terrible order. Unfortunately, the fighters fail to catch up with the bombers from Group 6. They run out of fuel and drop into the Arctic Ocean. The time has come to inform the Soviets that the bombers they can see have been sent by mistake. The Soviets take some convincing, especially as the bomber force has now entered their airspace. The president tries to convince Colonel Grady to abort the mission, but standard procedure involves ignoring all verbal orders, including the president's. The Soviets heard the whole exchange, and accept U.S. cooperation in their attempt to bring the bombers down. There is not much hope of success. Professor Groschall tells the Secretary of Defense that the U.S. now has a great opportunity to launch a first strike against the Soviets and destroy them utterly. General Black politely informs Groschall that he is a moron, and that perhaps not speaking again ever might be an excellent new career path for him. Shortly after this, the president orders General Black to Andrews Air Force Base. It does not look likely that the Soviets will prevent the bomber from getting through, and if that should be the case, the president proposes a compromise to prevent a full-scale war. Sadly, it involves a U.S. city, some bombs and a lot of dead people. Understandably, the general is unhappy about the order but obeys nevertheless. The president orders his staff to cooperate fully with the Soviets. This causes Colonel Castillo to suffer a breakdown when he is ordered to tell the Russians about the weak points of U.S. aircraft and how best to destroy them. He regains his composure just long enough to assault General Bogan and try to seize command of the base, claiming falsely that he is acting under presidential orders. No one believes him and he is led away cursing them all for traitors. The president decides to let his staff know the full extent of his backup plan. In the highly likely event that the bomber should get through, and when it is clear that Moscow has been destroyed, the president will order the nuclear destruction of New York. This will cost the US and the USSR a comparable number of casualties. Everyone is appalled, including Professor Megadeth over there. As the bomber crew report in on their approach to Moscow, the government tries to use Grady's wife in a last-ditch attempt to show him that there is not a war on, and could he please return to base before everyone dies. He does not listen. Once the president receives the dreadful news of the destruction of Moscow, he orders General Black to destroy New York. He obeys, and takes his own life after the weapons have been released. Before he succumbs to the lethal poison, he remembers his dream. "The matador is me," he whispers before breathing his last. Sidney Lumet was already an acclaimed director before he began work on Failsafe. With movies such as 12 Angry Men to his credit, he added to his reputation for enlightened celluloid storytelling with this high-tension thriller. After making this film, he would go on to produce such memorable films as The Hill, The Anderson Tapes, Dog Day Afternoon, Serpico, Murder on the Orient Express, and Network. He sadly passed away in 2011, leaving us a legacy of thought-provoking cinema, of which this film is a single part. But what an engaging and multifaceted part it is. The tension is primarily built, as indeed it should be, by excellently written dialogue and some memorable set pieces which drive the plot forward, but in addition to this, Lumet's use of camera angles creates a claustrophobic atmosphere, and his inspired use of close-ups at exactly the right moment underscore the pressure on the characters. Driving the somber feel of this piece is the absence of music. There are no music stings carrying the developments as the situation grows worse. This merely heightens their significance. The viewer is left feeling a sense of interest in all of the characters in this film, which is very unusual for a film with a comparatively large cast, especially in terms of anti-nuclear films. This is due to the inspired camera work and the juxtaposition of light and dark we see in the whole film, but it is mainly due to the extraordinary talent of the actors involved. The characters of Colonel Casillo's parents are on screen for less than a minute, but they are not hard to remember when the Colonel makes reference to them in the botched coup scene. Everyone turns in an excellent performance. Dan O'Reilly as the General with a conscience, Walter Matthau playing the insufferable Professor Groshaw, Larry Hagman as the interpreter, bringing that subtle blend of professionalism and deep nervousness to his character which makes Buck a character you can believe in, and finally, Henry Fonda as the President, stoic, seemingly unflappable, but ultimately human. The cumulative effect of all of these elements produces a thriller which leaves the viewer sweating with the rising tension. Upon release, the film did not do so well. This is largely due to the fact that it was eclipsed by the world-famous Doctor Strangelove. The interesting thing is that both films are among the first to postulate the notion of nuclear war occurring by accident, be it human or mechanical, or caused by some unforeseen activity. The only two other films I can think of would be War Games and By Dawn's Early Light. What is interesting about War Games is that the role of a policy planner such as Professor Groshaw is adopted by a billion-dollar computer known as the Whopper, which spends all its time thinking about World War III. Clearly the most depressed piece of artificial intelligence since Marvin the Robot from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Failsafe goes deeper than our apparent dependency on technology and becomes a psychological study not just of the characters but the attitudes of whole nations. The deep resentment that Colonel Casillo has towards his parents leads to a crisis of self-confidence which he chooses to tackle by asserting his authority. When his attempt to usurp General Bogan is thwarted, he refers to his parents as those people and shouts at the general that he is better than him. When the professor's theories about victory in a nuclear conflict are put to the test in the most dreadful of circumstances, he announces that documents which are vital to the U.S. economy should be rescued from New York. He makes no mention of the dying population. Returning to his seat, he repeats his words to himself. It would seem that the hawkish academic is asking himself why he still believes the things that he does. The president in conversation with the Soviet premier talks of responsibility, and that claiming responsibility for our actions is what makes us human. And finally, having begun with a recurring nightmare, General Black has his answer. The question for us is, if we are the matadors, who is our bull, and should we be in the ring in the first place? Beginning by encouraging us to think about the nuclear issue, the movie finishes by encouraging us to remember that who we are is what we do. This fact alone makes it unique in Cold War drama. That's all for this episode. I do hope you will join us next time on Nuclear Nightmares, but until then remember,
you are better off in your own home. Stay there.
No Kylie, no Jason, no toothpaste round the basin. By golly, we're jolly, jolly's what we are. No slimming, no jogging, no slurping, public snogging. We're after some laughter, ha 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 ha. No Kylie, no Jason, no toothpaste round the basin. By golly, we're jolly, jolly's what we are. No slimming, no jogging.